Hello, I'm Dahl Russell, and this is the story behind the music. Today I'll be giving a pre-concert lecture about two Mozart works, and after each part, a little symbol will appear up here that you can click on to hear the piece of music right after I finish the lecture, or you can wait until the end and then listen to both. I'll begin with the Flute Concerto of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the composer of both pieces that I'll be speaking about. This is his Flute Concerto in G major. Mozart wrote several works for flute that have remained a constant in concert repertoire. Perhaps the best known is his Concerto for Flute and Harp. He disliked both instruments, and to be fair, both instruments were going through transitions that made them fairly unstable during his lifetime, and this was an essential component of his dislike. But for a flute, Mozart had the good fortune to know the master flautist of the Mannheim Court Orchestra, Johann Baptist Wendling, who was instrumental in the development and perfecting of the transverse flute, the flute we know today as the flute. Just a generation before, you would have been likely to find the recorder being played in an orchestra. Wendling also arranged the commission of these works for flute by Mozart by a rich Dutch amateur flautist, De Jong. So while these were ostensibly composed on commission for De Jong, not the mustard, Dijon, De Jong, Wendling was waiting in the wings, and most likely he premiered these works in public as both Wendling and Mozart traveled to Paris. Wendling had been an important friend for Mozart and supporter of his. Mozart and his mother had traveled to Mannheim hoping for and expecting an appointment to the esteemed orchestra. It didn't happen, and Wendling went out of his way to make sure that in the midst of their dashed expectations that they were housed and cared for, and he quickly set up these commissions with the patron. With some composers, like Mahler or Schumann, their work is a direct window into their emotional life. With others, like Beethoven, the work seems completely set apart from the daily vicissitudes, a kind of Clinton-esque ability to separate different parts of their lives. Mozart fell somewhere in between. Certainly the style of the day, the classical era, was largely light and crisp, and the tone of the works was almost a predetermined whole, unlike later romantic works that would run around to different places with your emotions. This trip to Paris signified the end of Mozart's hopes, also for a relationship with the singer Aloysia Weber, the older sister of Constanze, the woman he later married. Aloysia and her mother were playing a manipulative and advanced game of hearts, multiple potential suitors using Aloysia's accomplished singing voice and her beauty as a trump to catch the biggest fish. With the return to Mannheim with his mother, and then the denial of a court post, Mozart went from being a potential catch to persona non grata. So for Mozart, stung with both professional and romantic rejection, the required delivery of these commissioned works to Paris came as a convenient exit stage left. And he was traveling with a known virtuoso who could premiere these works in Paris, Wendling. Of this group of commissioned works for flute, this concerto is considered the most important. Now, some musicologists feel that we can always tell Mozart's commissioned works because his heart and soul aren't really in them. But it could also be that knowing these works were composed on commission colors the way that they listen to them. The reality is that even when on commission, Mozart was inspired with an individuality of composition and color that lifts his works well above the conventional. It doesn't hurt that he had a master flautist at his disposal to give him input on writing in ways that suit the instrument, at the same time that he expanded the expectations and technical demands on the performer by his composition. Just as with his concerto for flute and harp, he had been commissioned to compose a work that was simple and achievable by an amateur, and what he provided was suitable for the best performers of his day and of ours. You can listen to the Flute Concerto by clicking this link here. The second work by Mozart is his Symphony No. 39. The Flute Concerto that I just spoke about was written when he had been rejected both professionally and personally. This work of Mozart was written at an even darker time, completed just 3 days after the death of his infant daughter, Teresia. Now, before we read this emotional fact into the music, it is somewhat mitigated by the fact that no musicologist has been able to ascertain definitively when Mozart began working on this symphony. They have found no notes or sketches to help them pinpoint the inception of the work. This was the first of his last 3 symphonies. It was completed on June 26, 1788, the day before a letter to Michael Puchberg to thank him for a loan of money, asking for patience on the repayment, and, as was typical of Mozart, asking for a larger loan over a longer period. Puchberg was a great supporter of Mozart and loved his music, but he rejected this sweet financial overture. Now, the Masonic lodges of the days were associated with great composers and conductors, and they often had some of the best symphonies in Europe. These last 3 symphonies may have been part of a trilogy of Masonic symphonies. Joseph Haydn was a Freemason brother of Mozart, and he had just completed a series of 6 symphonies for the Masonic Lodge in Paris. Another example, Joseph Bologne, le Chevalier de Saint-Georges, a professional soldier who was also a virtuoso violinist and composer, sometimes referred to as le Mozart Noir, the Black Mozart, was also a conductor of one of the largest Masonic orchestras in Paris. It is entirely possible that this Mozart symphony was begun much earlier, and he had just been waiting for a time to use it. It is known that Mozart liked to work his music out in his head, and including his symphonies. He often said that it was already composed in his head, worked out, and complete in his brain, and that when he wrote it down, he was just putting the notation down on paper. So while this symphony is noted for its power and its suspended dissonances and a soft combination of instruments, flutes, clarinets, and bassoons, which some equate to this time of loss of his child, it also has overall a playfulness and vigor that makes it more likely that he had prepared it in advance, hoping to have subscription concerts. Mozart had almost completely disappeared from public life at the time this symphony was completed. His Don Giovanni had been a huge success in Prague, but it had only been moderately successful in Vienna, which dampened the hopes for more subscription concerts. It's not known whether this symphony was ever performed during his lifetime. Less than 3 years after the death of his infant daughter, Mozart himself followed her to the grave. You can hear this symphony here. The links for these symphonies are also down below in the text underneath these lectures. I'm Cara Dahl Russell. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my love of music with you and hopefully give you new insights into these works as you listen to them.